kid, we spent some time in Mexico, and there were times that we would ride horses, and you got to be careful around those things. They get a little ornery, and they can kick you, and they can break something or hurt you real bad. But the farmer, what he would do, because recognizing this tendency, is he would put a spike on the end of a stick. A goad is what it's called, Old King James. He'd have it as part of the plowing harness, and as a result then, as long as the animal was moving forward, it was fine. But if it decided it wanted to stop, or if it decides it wants to try to kick back at the farmer, it ends up kicking that goad, that steel spike, and it ends up hurting itself. So it's interesting that Jesus uses that expression with Saul. It's hard for you to kick against the goads. Sometimes the resistance that people have to the work of God in their lives, they're only hurting themselves. And it's not only true for nations, but it's true for individuals. I mean, people wrestling or fighting and having great difficulty surrendering or submitting to the will of God. I think it's in Genesis chapter 32, where Jacob is wrestling with God. Literally. He's literally wrestling with him. And as a result, the day begins to break. He has to face his brother Esau. He's afraid of his brother Esau because of the swindling that he did of the birthright and of the blessing from his brother. It's been 20 years. And God has abundantly blessed him in that absence. God has dealt with him. But at the same time, he is still afraid. He's going home. He's still afraid. And now he's wrestling. And it comes to the point where then in his wrestling, the Lord says, "The day is breaking, let me go." And Jacob refuses to let him go. He says, "I won't let you go until you bless me." I mean, it's almost like you would think, and I wrestled in high school, you would think that the guy that wins the wrestling match is the one that's getting the blessing. But in order, for him culturally to ask for the blessing, it was an acknowledgement that the person that he is wrestling with is greater. So, bless me. I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. Okay, what's your name? Hangs his head. A lot of Christians name their kids Jacob. But the meaning of the name is kind of, in the Hebrew, it's not that. It's kind of like, I'm going to name my son Conman. Supplanter, a guy that wants to replace you. That's the idea of the name. And so when God asks him, "What's your name?" he's not proud of his name because it describes his character in the flesh. But then he says, "Your name will no longer be Jacob anymore. It'll be Israel, governed by God, for with God you have power." But the other thing that he does in his wrestling with God is God puts this hip out of joint, and now all he can do is hobble around. I got problems with my knee. I'm hopeful that it'll get better. It puts you in a situation where you can't run, you can't fight, you can't hide. I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about Jacob. Well, the last time you heard about me getting in a fight, or running for that matter? I'm happy when I can walk. But it's just interesting that people somehow think that they can fight or wrestle or resist the will of God. You can. You can. But you will do damage to yourself in the process. And yet maybe you're thinking, well, if I do submit to God, if I surrender to His will, even nations, because they're faced with, you have sometimes nations that are governed by kings or by presidents or by prime ministers that have made those choices throughout human history. Hey, you know what? We know that there is a God. We know that we're accountable to God. But I'm going to resist God. Or, again, too, even God's special place that He has for His people. God had said to Abraham, the nations that bless you, I'm going to bless, and those that curse you, I'm going to curse. You think every nation would look at the Bible and make it part of their foreign policy. Hey, you know what? We want to be a friend of the nation of Israel. But most nations aren't. Matter of fact, if anything, most nations are antagonistic to the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel has very few friends. And it's clear that by the time Zechariah chapter 14 happens, will the nation of the United States be part of that? I don't know. But it says all nations. But ultimately, it is a futile